welcoming our three wonderful speakers, Mel Hoyes, Naomi Ackie, and Andy Pryor, who I will leave it to Lola Olufemi, who is the Cambridge University Students' Union Women's Officer, to introduce.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming. As Louis said, my name is Lola, and I'm going to do an introduction of our lovely speakers. So Melanie Hoyes, at the end, joined the BFI in 2016 as the BFI Filmography Researcher. She's working on a research project to acquire diversity data about ethnicity for the BFI Filmography in the Collections Information Database in order to inform improved policy and practice at the BFI and the UK film industry in general. The research was launched at the BFI's Black Star LFF Symposium and written up in a piece in Sight and Sound magazine. She has a background in academic research, having taught undergraduates at the University of Sussex and worked in the UCL Library Services for over a decade. Sitting next to her, we have Naomi Ackie, who is a British independent film award-winning actress, her first major role being Anna in the widely acclaimed period drama Lady Macbeth. And then we have Andy Pryor, who's trained as a stage manager at London Central School of Speech and Drama. After becoming assistant director at the Bush Theatre, he worked with Gail Stevens' CDG for 5 years in some of the most successful and critically acclaimed film and TV dramas of the 1990s, including Trainspotting, Cracker and Our Friends in the North. Since setting up the Andy Pryor Casting Agency in 1998, he has cast a diverse and exciting range of projects, including Life on Mars, I'm Alan Partridge, The Long Firm, Cutting It, Whitechapel, Upstairs Downstairs, for which he received an Emmy nomination. 3 series of Cool, The Midwife, Cucumber, Banana, and Dr. Foster. And he has also cast several feature films, including Bent and Beautiful Thing. So. I wanted to start off the conversation actually maybe reflecting on the title of the panel, so this idea of who's missing. And I think it often implies that people's stories are kind of innocently forgotten and not actually deliberately untold. And I thought I'd start with you, Melanie, talking about like your research and if you see any patterns emerging in terms of who is there, who isn't, what stories are told, and whether, I don't know, you could speak to this idea that people or people's stories don't just go missing. There's a vested interest maybe in withholding or not telling.
That was a long question.
Sorry.
No pressure. Yeah, so my research, I say only, so I did a 10-year sample from just over 10 years for my research, which was 2006 to 2016. And it was for Black Star, so it was mainly looking at on-screen talent and black actors in particular because it was for the Black Star Festival. And who's missing? I mean, everyone, everyone else, essentially. So yeah, I mean, it was quite horrific. So we figured out that around 59% of those films, which was around 700 out of just over 1,000 films, did not feature one black actor in a named role at all. So they may have had, we didn't do bit parts, I had 2 months to count like 45,000 people. But there wouldn't have been anybody with a name that's potentially had a speaking part that had any impact on the narrative whatsoever in 59% of those films, which is pretty horrific. And then where you did have those people or where there were films with large black casts, they were often about things that you might expect, so things like gangs and civil rights. So, you know, they were about being black. They weren't, there were very few examples, if maybe one example of a film where you have a black protagonist who doesn't have to talk about those things. It's just they get to be in a family and go to Tesco's and something happens and there's a drama or, you know, they're in love. Like, that doesn't happen. And it was no surprise really that one of the only genres to over-index for black actors was crime. So about 60% of films in that genre had black actors in a named role. So, you know, thoroughly depressing. But What was your question? There was 5. What about how many I answered?
I think you've answered it in
Okay,
terms
good.
of like trends and patterns and what you found. And I wanted to talk a bit about then asking, like, moving on to everyone else on the panel, what then the value of representation becomes, because I think when we talk about representation, we often talk about, seeing somebody on screen, but we don't extend that conversation to whether that is nuanced representation, whether it's complex, whether it's, and so I guess, Naomi, did you want to, like, if you want to speak to that or talk about your experience of Lady Macbeth in relation to that question?
Well, Black Panther, let's just start with Black Panther, because yes, girl, seriously, because that is that has
forever.
That is like Wakanda forever. I feel like I've been acting in TV and film very recently, only the last 3 years really. There is something that is clearly missing, because the thirst and the way people ran to the cinema to see that film means that there is a huge, huge amount of people from all different races, not even just black, who want to see something different. I mean, my experience as an actor is very different to my experience as an audience member, and what I really feel like now, especially when you talk about the statistics of it, my frustration, I've actually started boycotting shows and films. Because if I look on the poster and I just see an all-white cast, I'm not interested. I'm just not. And I won't ever be, and actually I'm allowing myself to be angry now. I think for a very long time it was, you need to fight for it, or you need to eloquently say, I feel the situation. No, I'm just vexed. I'm pissed off by it. I don't want to watch it. That's my experience. And as an actor, in that same thing, I'm doing the same thing. I'm not saying yes to parts that would put me into a box that I don't feel like I can defend in situations like this, where I can talk to people and go, this is my work and what does it represent? I'm not doing that, and the parts are there to play the poor single mother. The parts are there to play, the crime lord, or it's too many. It's so many. That's kind of where I'm at.
I think it's what makes Lady Macbeth so interesting, because I think there's a narrative that this country likes to tell itself about its history, and this whole idea of having people of colour in a period drama was somehow was radical and revolutionary in the way that it was spoken about.
So how do you feel this country was built? I'm not being funny. Like the amount of times I had Q&As at that time where people would be like, and how do you feel, representing being a black person in that time, was that a real thing? And it's like, oh my goodness, yes, it was. It's the whole world was colonized by the British Empire, and it's not necessarily the fault of people. I mean, there is Google, but it's not necessarily the fault of the wider population. It's actually, we have been eliminated, and I agree with you when it comes to the missing, the idea of missing. It's like we've always been here.
And had our own stories.
And had our own stories to tell.
Not just the Windrush kids.
No, we're not just the Windrush kids, and I think that's where, I get the chill up my spine, where I'm like, it doesn't feel fair or right, and it feels like I look at my own history, and it almost feels like there's a part of it that I can't even comprehend, and that's not fair. That's not fair, because we are a time where information is important. We're a time, especially a time where stories and information kind of intermingle, and if you don't have access to that, then you don't have an access to a part of yourself.
At the Black Star Symposium, so at the London Film Festival, we launched the data, and we had a whole day symposium about this exact question. People like Amara Sante and Noel Clarke came along, and David Oyelowo did the keynote speech. You can watch on YouTube. But he talked about writing a treatment for a film that was about a black boxer whose gym only got knocked down because they built Nelson's column in Trafalgar Square. So really interesting period story, because he loves a period drama, had never seen himself in one of these period dramas. So wrote a treatment, and he was kind of reading out the responses that he got about how you know, from like a big, he didn't say who it was, probably the BBC, but, you know, why they wouldn't make the story, because it was just, they like to revisit stories that they know people like from this time, and he talked about it as being whitewashed out of his own history. And I think, you know, and it was at that point he realised he needed to leave, and he went to the US and worked there, and I think, you know, apart from the kind of psychological damage for audiences for not seeing themselves represented as an industry, we are missing out on people who leave to go and work in the States, which, you know, let's be honest here, it's not like the States is the utopia of race, but there are more opportunities to work as an actor, to be represented on screen, and that is problematic to me. The stats showed that to me, and I think people were quite shocked at how stark that was, because our industry is failing actors and representation in our industry, and that's that, like on a purely kind of industry financial level, you know, we're not doing good enough at that.
And like you both said, it's a huge underestimation of audience to think that, you know, the arguments behind not showing a wide range of different ways of being is that those audiences aren't there or those films won't sell, when we know time and time again that that's not the case. I wanted to come to you, Andy, and then talk about what you think then the role of a casting director is in this project to subvert you know, an industry where we're still having these conversations and we're still trying to talk about diversity and stuff like that. What do you see?
Well, I think that, you know, it's for many casting directors, it's kind of in our DNA now to think diversely, and you know, part of our job is to educate young filmmakers and young producers, and I think there's a slight fear around the subject, around, you know, among young producers in the industry who kind of don't quite know what to do with it. They're worried about, you know, should we have quotas? And it's like, it's not about quotas, it's about always being aware and always being vigilant and being aware that, you know, you need to reflect your audience. And if you want a varied audience, you've got to show them the whole of that audience. And, you know, it's in every area. It covers, you know, race, gender, sexuality, disability. There are, you know, millions of people who are just not seeing themselves on screen in any way at all positive, or very often just not seeing themselves at all. And, you know, if you want to appeal to a wide audience, you've got to address that. And we were talking about Black Panther back there, weren't we? And how, you know, I don't know where this idea that a film with a largely black cast can't be popular came from. It's just, you know, an assumption maybe, but what it shows is if you do something well, people will go and see it, you know, regardless of who's in it. And there is an industry obsession with stars, and you know, because of the large numbers of white actors compared to non-white actors, it's sort of inevitable that there'll be a greater proportion of stars that are white, whereas actually audiences respond to good work and good performances. And I'm pretty convinced that, you know, they don't go and see something just to see a particular actor. They go because there's a good buzz about it.
There's a good story. I wanted to come on to, I think what's great about projects like Black Panther and also Banana, which you cast, is that it allows an imagined future. And that future is necessarily outside of all of the things that you've been told that you should be if you belong to a particularly marginalized group. And just thinking about Banana, like Violet and Sean's story, there's a story about a lesbian with OCD, there's a trans character. I wanted to know then for you, what your experience of casting that project was like, and whether these decisions for you were deliberate, and were you thinking about your audience? Were you thinking about how people would relate to those characters when you...
Well, I think credit for that completely goes to Russell T Davies, because it was completely his idea, and he's taught me a lot about thinking diversely in casting, because he does what I'd like to see more writers do. He writes a trans character, he writes a black character, not only a black character, but specifically what their heritage is, you know, and it's very easy when you get a script to go, well, you know, let's make sure we've got enough black people and enough disabled people, and, you know, we have that tussle with our producer and director about who plays what, whereas if the writers address this from day one, then it's easy, you know, it's very easy, and also it makes the audience think about, you know, more than the trouble with diverse casting is it ends up very often being quite tokenistic. You know, you go, oh, it's a very white episode. We better make that policewoman black. Yeah. And what I find interesting is, you know, quite often you have a really great part of a bad guy, and you know, not a drug dealer, but a bad guy. And you go, well, you know, how about X black actor? And they go, oh no, we can't cast a black person as a bad guy. And it's like, well, you want to play good parts. You know, actors want to play good parts. They don't want to play cliched bad guys, but you know, people do pussyfoot around it a bit. And what we try and, I'm in the Casting Directors Guild, we try and encourage our younger members to be a bit braver about challenging that stuff when they see it, and you know, entering into those conversations early on in the process. But going back to Banana, I mean, it's just a gift to have scripts where you've got one episode that's almost entirely performed in Yoruba, and you know, you've got an episode about a trans person, and you know, they were proper stories and not just a kind of hodgepodge of diversity for its own sake.
Yeah, and like Melanie said, they were stories in which, you know, being trans, being black were not central aspects to the character. I wanted to ask, to come back to you, Naomi, and I think when we have conversations about diversity, often maybe behind closed doors, there is an idea or a sense that the actors aren't there. And so I don't know what your kind of route into becoming an actor was, but I wondered whether you could talk about like the importance of Arts Council funding or youth theatres, which we know are being like devastatingly cut across the country in terms of giving marginalised people a route into becoming.
I mean, I studied at Central. The reason why I even thought I could get into drama school was because I went to City and Islington in London, and they came to our college. And the thing about drama school is that you have to pay for every audition. It's 50 quid, right? And there are like a handful of things, but I ain't got no money. So like, I had to really, really think about it as well. I had to go, okay, I want to go to RADA, I want to go to Central, that's £100 right there.
Just for 2 auditions?
Just for 2 auditions. And you got Lambda if you want to go to Guildhall. So they came and they gave us free certificates to say I can have a free audition. Thank you very much, Central. Before that, I've been working at this since I was 11 years old. For some of my more middle class counterparts, I can't say the same, that they could afford to start later. But I was very lucky to have the brain that I have, but also the family I have to be like, okay, Nay, if you want to do this, you got to start young. So I started at 11 and I worked in different theatres, in different theatre groups, scholarships to different Saturday schools. I mentored children when I was in college. I just completely immersed myself in that world. The thing is, I think for people like myself, working class, black, young girl, we're not always instilled with the confidence to know that we can go out into those worlds. I was very lucky to have a family that kind of was like, Nay, if you want to do it, you do it, and you do it properly, you do it the right way. I can't say that that support is happening everywhere, and that is why there's only a handful. We were literally, because we're upstairs, we were like, you know, who are the like young, like black women right now? I was like, okay, well, I think I can call myself one. Michaela Cole. 3, there you go. That's number 3, and that is not nearly enough. And the only reason that is not because we are missing that is not because there aren't talented young women and men of all different colours and abilities and whatnot and sexualities who aren't there. It's just that the confidence isn't there for them to pursue what is available, and unfortunately what is available is dwindling as well.
Yeah.
And if you don't see yourself,
if you don't see yourself,
that you can go and do that.
I saw this thing on Twitter, back to Black Panther. I saw this, we're not letting it go, Wakanda forever. I saw this thing on Black Panther where it was in the States. This person had video recorded this 2 black men by the poster of it. And they were pointing at it and they were like, did you see it? Where it was just like, this is what it feels like. to be supported about who I am. That's that's insane. For some people, that's a dream that my parents couldn't ever think about. And to be represented, as an example, I'm also a writer, right? And I'm writing this piece, and I talked to a writer I know, and she was like, okay, so tell me about her experience. All that time I've been writing this character, now this is weird, but in my head, I know she's black, but I've been imagining her white. All that time. And it's only when I was asked about it that I was like, oh shit. Like that's not my fault. That's not my fault. It's because what I see, when I see awkward women, when I see women in love, when I see women struggling with something, is usually white. Lady Bird, beautiful film, I'm sorry. All white cast, well, nearly all white cast. You know, there is a space to be a full person and experience so much. And when we're having these discussions, it's literally, and the amount of people that have a bit of an issue around it as well, and it's like, literally just let me experience it all. I just want it all. I'm allowed, because I am it. Do you know what I mean? That's who we are on a daily basis, and that's yeah.
I think that's why the work that you do, Melanie, is so important to the normalization. So first, acknowledging the problem by gathering statistics and data. And what you said about if you don't see yourself, then you might not be able to have that imagined future that we were talking about before. So I wanted to ask you a bit about backlash and how these conversations often get derailed. And this comes back to what you were saying, Andy, about how people are a bit sensitive, or people don't have the language in order to speak. And I wonder whether your research is looking actually not only into the actual films and the statistics, but also the cultural shift that needs to happen if we're going to have meaningful conversations.
Yeah, I mean, it's all intertwined. I think the really lovely thing about the data, as depressing as it is that it's really hard to refute, because I have racially profiled 45,000 people over 10 years, and it's really, so all of that kind of conversation about, oh, well, that's one person's experience, that's anecdotal, it's hard for all actors, it's hard for everybody, it's just a difficult business, that's just how it is, kind of cannot be argued when you see how stark. And it isn't changing. That's the other thing I wanted to say, is that year on year, even when there were more films made, the amount of leads stays kind of the same for black actors. It's not going up. We can't pat ourselves on the back. It's not, we haven't fixed it. It's kind of the same. And so yeah, I think that is the good thing about the data. But then it's about sort of saying, well, that's really depressing, but what can you actually do to make the difference? And and it is a cultural shift. I think the whole industry, if you have an industry that's predicated on being a freelance industry, that you work with your mates, you've got a budget, you need to get things done, it's all about networking, it's all about who you know, who you've worked with before. If you don't step out of that box, it will never change. Of course, the same stories, the same ways of working are going to happen. So really it is a cultural shift about just always bearing diversity in mind, and thinking about the ways in which you can do things differently, making a choice to hire someone else, get new people in, give somebody a chance that you haven't worked with before, all of those kind of things. But that's not an easy thing. It's an established industry that feels like it's working. So it's very hard. And let's be honest here, when we're talking about inclusion and we're talking about diversity, we are coming. We are saying some of you are going to have to not do this because you have to be replaced by other people. So it's a difficult conversation to have, because the reality of that is that people are a bit like, oh, does that mean I don't get to do my job anymore? And that's the reality of making sure more people are represented, is that you are cutting into their percentage of work.
So true.
And so that makes it a difficult conversation to have, because without sort of looking aggressive or you're trying to come for people, but that's essentially what we're talking about, really. So it is a difficult conversation, and I think it's why people are slow to change, because they don't quite know how to negotiate that. And we had our Black Star season, so every year at the BFI we have a blockbuster season at the end of the year for about 3 months, and it's normally about, we've had ones on love and sci-fi, normally like quite genre-based, and Black Star was a real departure from that, because obviously all these questions that it's tied, it's not just about black actors, it's tied up in these questions. And there was a letter written, I think it was to the Telegraph probably, and from one of our sort of old school members, because the BFI scene is a very, you know, and it is, it's a very sort of white middle class endeavour, looking at the canon, which is ultimately quite white and made by white guys, and you know, that is the institution that we are. And one of our old members sort of wrote in and said, like, this is political correctness gone mad. You know, I'm going to be cancelling my membership. Bye. But you know, but that is a bit. All jokes aside, and as much as we are a bit like, go then, but you can't. Those are people that invest in our institution. Those are the people that have membership. Those are the people that come to our cinemas. So you don't, and I'm not saying like diversity is about, and it is inclusion. So I don't want them all to go away so that we can take over. Like it's not. That's not what it's about. So you have to find ways of like negotiating that, and it makes people nervous. You know, you have to negotiate that question all the time, and it's difficult.
I want to come back to you, Naomi, to ask whether you, as an actor, do you see that there's more of an appetite or more of the ability or more freedom than to have, you know, meaningful conversations about diversity and inclusion in independent filmmaking? Has that been your experience versus trying to go up, for mainstream films? Yeah.
No, I think you're spot on, to be honest. Mainstream films, in its nature, tend to be more difficult for actors anyway. You've got to kind of fit a certain standard and a size and a colour and a hair texture, especially if you're a woman. Indie films feels like a safer space and there's more discussion around it. It's not like I would say no to a good old Marvel, but thanks, babes. Yeah, just get a Marvel, thanks. But like the ones I have read for, it's like very limiting still, and that was pre-BP. I won't say the name anymore.
When you read for Anna for Lady Macbeth, did you have a sense that you could have more control over the narrative in that way? Because I think Lady Macbeth asks really interesting questions, because obviously the cast is diverse, but then if you think about the role of Anna, who goes mute halfway through the film, and is the vehicle through which, you know, the white protagonist is able to realize her power, her anti-hero kind of status.
I think what's interesting about that, what you experience a lot, what I experience a lot is feeling like the wild card. So there's a lot of spaces I go into in auditions and stuff where it's like, I know this was written for a white girl, I know, and they're just like testing it out just to see if they just want to dip their toe into the dark side and see what's going on over there. And so you enter spaces knowing you have to fight twice as much and be twice as good in that kind of very typical way to get noticed. When it came to Lady Macbeth, I went in being like, I ain't got this. Period drama, of course it's. I've never seen a period film with a black girl in it. I did it, and you know, thankfully I got it. I felt like the conversation afterwards was very interesting. When I first read the script, it to me screamed intersectional feminism. That's partly why I was so interested in it. But the kind of talk about it afterwards was very much about, you know, Catherine and, you know, this feminist hero and all of. I was just like, that girl's a bitch, all the way through. She killed a. I don't know spoilers, but she kills a lot of people. She kills a lot of people. She does some very bad things.
She doesn't really care.
She doesn't care. There's no, and it's like, to me, I read that and I was like, this is fantastic. And partly why is because as an artist, part of my work is not only to make the work, but to discuss its subjects afterwards. when I went into spaces, I had one discussion where the woman was like, you know, and Anna is very loyal to Catherine. I was like, hold up. I was like, there's no loyalty. Yeah. It's not about loyalty. There was no choice in anything that Anna had to do. So it feels like sometimes there's a screen of like not wanting to push past the boundaries of what is comfortable, because ultimately, then it means you have to question yourself. If you look at Catherine as a hero, how do you look at a lot of white counterparts in our society today? That means you have to look at yourself and go, ooh, am I being tricked?
Or am I
Is this a lie? Am I living in a lie? And I think what's so interesting about diversity is that we as diverse people, but like, we as diverse people know this is a lie. We live in that lie every single day. When I see myself, people like myself represented, I know that ain't true. That's the truth I can offer if the gates were open. And they are but we are coming, like, it's true, we're coming, there's no choice in the matter. Because we're taking back what is ours. The whole concept, and I think why people are so protective over this industry and other things anyways, because they know it's not theirs in the first place. You took it, so we're taking it back. You borrowed it, thank you.
You've had a lovely time.
You've had a nice
had a lovely time.
You made your little
I'd
money.
like the ball back to play now.
Bring it on back and let's take it home.
I also, when you were talking, I was thinking in particular of the scene when Anna is basically chastised by Boris for drinking the wine. And that idea of asking audience members to think about themselves, like white audience members, to think about themselves and their own complicity, the way that Catherine allows Anna to take the fall for that, even though it's not her fault. I think that's a question that's also posed to the audience and one that comes out of the things that you were saying. I wanted to ask, just generally, and also to you maybe specifically, Andy, about this idea of how the way that you present a character to someone when you're casting them. So the idea of like the universalization of experience, and you don't want to cast someone because they're black or because they belong to a marginalized group. But I think within that, how important do you think it is to recognize also that those stories are under, like the story specifically about being black in whatever context or about being a marginalized person in whatever context haven't been told and are need to be told. And so sometimes it is important to focus in on a particular experience of the world and how you balance that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, there's room for all stories and all kinds of stories, and there's room for stories that are specific to people's experience, marginalised groups. But I don't think any marginalised group, an actor from a marginalised group, is going to want to play that for the rest of their careers. You want a good mixture of work, and it really does come back to who you see on screen. And it's interesting the thing about the Black Panther poster, and this thing of young kids thinking, well, I can do that, and that's the problem with these careers, and that's behind the camera as well, that people grow up not thinking that it's something they can do. I was lucky enough I'm lucky enough to be old enough to have got my fees paid and got a maintenance grant to go to drama school, which I wouldn't have been able to do. My family didn't have any money. I don't know what I would have ended up doing, but and I kind of found it hard enough then, so I don't know how people do it now, particularly in London, where most of the drama schools are. But, I was talking to a group of disabled actors at Spotlight, the Actors Directory, a few weeks ago, and, they hardly ever see any decent representations of themselves on screen, and they don't grow up thinking that's a career I can do because they don't see anybody else doing it. They might see an able-bodied person pretending to be disabled, but which is another debate entirely.
On a different day.
which I could go on about for hours, but it's really about who you see and creating opportunity, and it is getting harder for people from working class backgrounds, to get into this industry. And so casting directors try to find people from all over the place these days, and we no longer really see drama schools as the sole source of talent, because a lot of really great people can't afford to go there. But going back to people's stories, I think it's incredibly important to, at the commissioning point, to address that and to commission interesting and varied source work.
I also wanted to talk specifically in relation to disability about accessibility behind the scenes, but also in film. I know, Andy, that you've done quite a bit of work in making sure that the casting process is accessible for deaf and disabled actors, and I wondered whether you could speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting area because it is difficult. I mean, going back to Spotlight that I mentioned earlier, which is the home of casting, and they're a great organisation and do a lot of really good work with all kinds of marginalised groups, but even their central London building isn't wheelchair accessible, and that's because they haven't got the money to move somewhere else where they can do that. And I think there's a funding problem with all of this, and I think I met a disabled actress who got booked on a commercial, and when her agent sent through her access requirements, it required having a particular kind of portable loo. They were shooting in the middle of nowhere, and they were like, "Oh no, we can't provide that," and they sacked her. And it's kind of extraordinary that people can get away with that now, but I think it's got to become second nature for access requirements to be fulfilled.
I think often also when we talk about diversity, we often end up having a conversation that, like you said, Melanie, is quite depressing. And so I wanted to move on to ask just broadly everybody on the panel, apart from Black Panther, what the kind of you see as triumphs in theatre or filmmaking that have given you as an audience member or other people that imagined future, that imagined possibility, that have expanded our ideas of what it means to be a certain way.
I saw the best show I've seen from last year, Barbershop Chronicles.
Oh, I love
at
that.
the National Theatre. So beautiful, and it was beautiful story, beautiful actors. Partly it was just so hopeful, and it was seeing happy black men. Oh my gosh! They were happy, and they were telling a story, and there was conflict. Obviously, you need conflict for a story, but it was
Celebration,
joyful.
Yeah,
I think
there's so much dancing.
So much dancing. It was so
great.
joyful, and Brother Size, which I haven't had a chance to see yet. I think it's at the Young Vic.
Young Vic, yeah.
It's coming. It is coming, and it's there.
I think, and Hamilton, that's a really good example.
Oh my God, I love
However, I went to see Hamilton a month ago, and it's fantastic. I mean, I'm sure most of you know about it because it's, that's a good example of why you can have not white people in period drama.
Nobody cared. No one's going, George Washington wasn't black.
What?
It's just great.
I love how subversive it is and how much fun it is.
Yeah.
Completely white audience.
A shame. That's a shame.
And they're charging 150 quid for a seat.
I paid £37.50 for my seat.
Yes, mate.
I was in the gods, but I had it all.
Yeah.
But I think that's the other thing is that access to the arts has got to be dealt
Both
with
ways,
as well,
yeah.
because you want young kids to be able to go and see this stuff and go look at what they're doing and be inspired by it.
There was actually a thing. I'm really sorry. I'm just gonna this is the last time.
No, it's fine.
No, you don't. But literally, one of my mates, she did this thing for kids in Peckham, where you donated to give money so that kids in Peckham who wouldn't necessarily be able to afford it could go and see BP. And that there can be there is more of that. It's just. It's a I was saying, I think it's a classing as well of who the arts are for and who has the time, because it's like you in your life you go, okay, food, water, clothes, warm house. That's the basic. people spend so much time doing that. It's like only the elite can then go and enjoy what life means, and you know, all the joys and the colours and the music and all of that. And it's actually kind of bringing that down to a level so people feel like they are worthy of experiencing art, and it belongs to them.
Is that for you then the impetus to write? Is that what gives you the desire to want to?
I want more power. I want more power. I think that what I've realized now slowly is creating your own content means you can create how you want to see the world and how you want to offer it. And my intentions are good. I just want people to be represented. I want to tell good stories that make people feel something. So I'm starting to control it myself. I think that's the only way, because I can't just believe that things are going to somehow magically change. I'll do it myself.
And it's got to be addressed that way behind the scenes as well, going back to that. It's quite good that BAFTA have now brought in a rule that to be eligible for Best British Film, you have to demonstrate that you've thought diversely in front of and behind the camera.
BFI's diversity standard.
No, it's really good.
Just saying.
Which is really good, because nothing incentivizes people like the idea of taking their awards away.
Although money.
I don't quite know how that's working out, but I've already done a couple of films where that's been put into action, and I've never seen that before, so that's good.
I wondered, Melanie, if you could talk a bit more about what exactly those recommendations are. Are they about controlling the narrative, more having more people writing, more people trying to produce their own work?
The diversity standards. Yeah, all of that. So they go across, oh God, you're going to make me remember. They go across 4 areas, and that is in creative content, so narrative and storytelling, and key roles, so producers, directors, writers, and and opportunities for new, like emerging people, so apprenticeships and things like that, and then also into distribution and audiences. So throughout the process of film, all of the diversity standards need to be borne in mind in order to get the funding for your film. So it's those 4 areas.
Incredible.
And we're trying to roll them out to other people, so not just for our funding.
So now we'll open up to questions. Does anybody have any questions? Do we have like a... Do you want to...
My name is Ariana Novier. I'm from Colorado, live in Los Angeles now. That doesn't matter. So both you, Andy, and Naomi kind of talked about whose job it was for representation, whether it's the actor not going for that role or not accepting a role, or the casting director. But I found back home, everyone kind of puts it on the other person, like, oh, it's the producer, the director. So who do you think really has the adamant, like, we need to really get the ball rolling for everyone else to follow behind?
I think what we need to work towards is collective responsibility for that. And, you know, I'm an ambassador for an organisation called Act for Change that was set up because ITV put out a trailer for their forthcoming season, and it was only white faces, and a lot of us noticed that immediately, and challenged ITV directly. And you know, I don't think there was nothing malicious about it at all. It was just complete ignorance and lack of awareness. And organisations like that can bring it, and it's a top to bottom problem. I think, you know, broadcasters, film producers, we all need to be addressing this issue. And I think, for too long it has been about blaming the casting director, blaming the director, blaming the producer, blaming the BBC, whoever. You know, it's a real collective responsibility. And what worries me, and we were talking about this a bit back there, is that there is a lot of progress being made, but when that happens, people tend to become quite complacent. And I think that now is an even more important time to address that. And I genuinely think that most people in the film and TV industries are quite savvy about this now, but I think they've just got to not be scared to put it into practice. It's my take.
I agree. The Ghost in the Shell, or Ghost in the Shell, for instance, like, Scarlett Johansson, that part originally was for a Japanese woman, right? Now, how many times, I'm not being funny, how many times have we seen Scarlett Johansson like in a leotard or something, like fighting some people? Like bare times, so many times in, you know, in Avengers or whatever. For me, I'm like, these big old movie stars who are getting paid a lot of money, and it's probably very hard, yes, to say no to millions and millions. But if Scarlett Johansson or Matt Damon or
Emma Stone,
Tilda Swinton said no to Doctor Strange, if they went, actually, you know what? Instead of going like, oh, but we're trying to do something different, and because I'm a woman, it means it's different because it's diverse. It's like, no. How about you challenge it and you encourage other women and men of your ilk to go, actually, no, we're not going to do those parts. We're not going to allow that to happen. And I say that because people watch the movie stars. They're the ones that are like going on the red carpet and they look fancy and they're on the magazine covers. If they were like, no, actually, you know what? I'm gonna say no, and I'm gonna encourage all my friends to say no to that, and we're gonna put that back where it belongs, in the hands of someone else. I think there would be a kind of, at the same from like top to down, it'd be like inside out. And I feel like maybe it needs to kind of go from all angles of power, maybe.
Well, I know you didn't ask me, but just I can't shut up. But in my opinion, I feel like the gatekeepers need to change. So because if the gatekeepers looked different, none of those casting decisions would have happened. Like from top to bottom, that would not have happened, because they'd be saying, no, this is not a story for them. This is a story for us. And until you make that change for people, and that is, again, it's not coming for people, that's not racism, that's just people's bias. They understand it from their point of view. This is a story that I'd like to see. I'd like to see Scarlett Johansson in that role. That's just that's what they understand. If you had a person of colour, an Asian person in that position, they would want to see someone that looked like them in that role. So until you change the gatekeepers, I feel like it's harder, because you're right, but it's difficult to turn down work as an actor, like not Scarlett Johansson. She's got money, but you know, like it's difficult for you to have morals, but like you also got to eat. So it's hard. Like I feel like until it costs you. Whereas I feel like if you allow those positions, you know, the representation of minorities in high positions across the board, across cultural sectors, across the industry, across anywhere, on boards, making decisions is minute. So until you make that change for them to be able to bring their voice and their experience and their bias into the room, things don't change.
Should we take a couple of questions then?
Thanks for a really interesting discussion. Question for anyone on the panel, really. Do you get a sense of how these things are being, these issues are being handled in other countries? Okay, so what's it like in France? What's it like in Ireland? What's it like in the United States? I don't know what sense you have of this, but I mean, clearly the same issues are there and they're making films. Do you have any observations on that? Whether there are any lessons to learn from that, one way or the other? Who's doing well and who's doing better?
We'll take another one and then we'll answer.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Can I just answer that and say that something that I think in the UK we're kind of, this seems to be a big broader part of something to do with a question of a broader political identity, that we're quite obsessed with our past. And like, you know, in a way the empire, and that's where this obsession with period dramas and costumes come from. And America, there seems to be like, they're great at making modern things. And I think what we're talking about is a big modernisation of the industry, and together with that politics. And what you're talking about, you can just apply to the House of Commons at the same time.
Yeah, it's so true.
Why should our country look like that? When our country's not that, and that goes beyond just, you know, people of colour, of course, but it goes into drama schools, white working class kids are particularly affected. And I just wanted to add to that and see what you guys thought of that.
Should we go for that one?
Oh, me.
Oh, no. Everyone. So that question about international.
So talking about the international thing, I was at a really interesting talk about sort of representation, and there was a French feminist woman of colour who sort of set up a journal about film. And her, it sounded awful in France. Like, there's a real kind of lack of wanting to talk about their colonial past. They're just like, I'll get over it, it's all fine, look at us all living in harmony. So I don't know about the industry as a whole, but she was, from her perspective, she was certainly saying she felt as though none of that stuff was being addressed, and she was kind of ecstatic to be on a panel in London talking about these issues because it wouldn't happen, which is why she had to start writing it herself and writing film criticism that addressed those issues of representation. So that is one example. I don't know fully the situation there, but I thought that was really interesting because you kind of have this concept that everyone's doing better than you, and I'm not sure that's entirely true. And I think in terms of America, I think you're right that it's a kind, there's just more. There's more. They like making money. They see that there are audiences to be in a very cynical level. They're like box office, but there's all these people going to the cinema. We'll get them in as well. And I think so there are clearly more opportunities. A lot of our British actors talk about those opportunities and leaving to go to the States just because there is more stuff being made and therefore more representation. Whether they're doing anything better in, sort of consciously, I don't know. I just think there are opportunities for people like, Tyler Perry to just make millions and make a niche of films and just go and do it because it's, the land of opportunity or whatever, to do that kind of thing, which I think here you have someone like Noel Clarke who's doing a similar thing, but it's a struggle. He's made 3 kind of big, he's doing it, but he has to go and knock on people's doors and not leave the room until they give him money. And, he talks very freely about how institutions like ours haven't supported him to make those films, even though he's doing that work and he's, up there as one of the people that's allowing that kind of representation. So I think, that's it.
I think Mel's right. I think it's easy to think that it's better in America, but it's really about volume.
Yes.
And what you don't want is for Black Panther to be an aberration. You want that to be a kind of game changer. But a lot of it boils down to money as well. I mean, CBS and ABC both have really good diversity initiatives, which sometimes you look at them and think they look a little bit like they're doing it as their thing they should be doing rather than something really meaningful, but at least they're doing it. But on the whole, there is opportunity for actors of colour out there, but I'm still seeing a lot of the same actors. It's still the same 3 or 4 people who are playing those leads. There's not quite as much opportunity. We're hardly world leaders here, but I think we're doing better than mainland Europe on the whole.
I think also there's a lot to be learnt from international filmmakers, or just film outside of the global north. I think that's a conversation that never happens when we're thinking about like diversity or inclusion, because those films don't ever make it into our remit. They don't kind of exist when there's a great deal to be learnt from the way filmmakers in those countries, to speak about race in a majority black countries, etc. Do we have any more questions?
Just on that point, I was wondering in this conversation about increasing representation, and also Naomi's point earlier about there's a strange sort of worldview that's created by the lack of colonial history within film in Britain, right? So there's a perception that racism was invented by UKIP and nothing about what happened before that. So is it possible to create collaborations between Nollywood, Egyptian cinema, Senegalese cinema with the BFI, or is that kind of not at all within the remit of how the diversity conversation is going at the moment?
I mean, we are the British Film Institute, so one of the remits for getting funding from us is that you have to have some kind of production happening or funding happening within our country, but we're also gatekeepers of certification. So if people are making films and getting tax relief by, using a British company or filming in Britain, then we're the kind of gatekeepers for that money as well. So I think those collaborations do exist, but we are the BFI, and so a lot of the stuff that we do is kind of British film, which is what it is. So, but yeah, I mean, that's the kind of point of the diversity standards, is to look at that. We recently helped to fund I Am Not Your Witch, you know, which is an amazing film. So that, you know, that is kind of in there. We do try and look out, but also we're a funding body, so people come to us at the same time. It's not like we're often, you know, we're not always kind of going, oh, hi, you should come and work here. But yeah, I mean, it does happen, but we're very focused around British film and British money and production companies. So that, you know, yields what it yields, if you know what I mean. But yeah.
Fortunately, we have to, unfortunately,
Thank God.
Talking about it.
we have to end there, but I want to say thank you so much to our incredible panel. This has been an absolute joy, and I'm sure everyone here has learned so much, so thank you.
Thank you.
Well done. You get through them all.
I did, actually.
Well done. You were marvellous.